Welcome to Big City, Small Town, the weekly podcast all about San Antonio and the people who make it go and grow. I'm your host, Bob Rivard. Tom Slick was one of the most fascinating and visionary entrepreneurs in San Antonio history. He was a mid-20th century oil wildcatter, very successful one, an explorer, and a creator. Actually, why there is no statue or other public remembrance of this striking individual is a mystery to me. Yet, if you look around, his fingerprints are found all over the contemporary city. Slick tragically died in a small plane crash in the early 1960s, but while he was alive, he used his wealth to explore some of the most remote reaches of the planet, as well as the inner labyrinth of the human mind and spirit. In the 1940s, he founded the Texas Biomedical Research Institute here, as well as the Southwest Research Institute, two internationally recognized centers of excellence in San Antonio that too often fly below the general public's radar. Before his death, Slick also founded the nonprofit Mind Science Foundation, which he described this way, and it's a quote: "I regard the creation of the Mind Science Foundation as the most important undertaking of my life, and I plan to devote most of my time to it. I feel that the human mind has tremendous unexplored potential, and I want to go about the discovery of that potential in a scientific way." Close quotes. Today's guests on Big City, Small Town are Miriam Good, the president and CEO of the Mind Science Foundation and a longtime nonprofit leader, and Dr. Ben Rein, the foundation's chief scientist. Rainn is a Stanford-trained neuroscientist and a renowned science communicator with more than 1 million social media followers, including me. We're drawn to his ability to take scientific complexity and make it both captivating and easy to understand for a general audience. Dr. Rainn is based in Buffalo, New York, but he and Miriam Good join us in the Geekdom podcast studio in San Antonio today.
Well, we're just thrilled to be here, Bob. Thank you for inviting us and letting us talk about, we're both fans of Tom Slick, so it's a delight to come and share a little bit more about him.
Ben, thanks for coming all the way from Buffalo.
Yep, just landed earlier this morning. I'm very, very pleased to be here.
I think after 100 plus episodes, you've come the farthest to be on the podcast. So you hold that honor, and we'll probably hold it for a while.
Amazing.
Well, and we can go with first names, Miriam and Ben, yes, please. I've been fascinated with Tom Slick and the Mind Science Foundation since my family arrived here in 1989, and I began to learn more about this mysterious, larger-than-life figure. He left an enduring imprint on the city and beyond San Antonio in the world of scientific research. Yet, I dare say many in our audience have probably never heard of him.
And I think that's really unfortunate, because you have an individual who was, fortunate enough to have great material wealth. And yes, he did many adventures. He built many things, but above all, he was insatiably curious, and he used his wealth to investigate, Texas Biomed with its basic science, Southwest Research with applied science. But then for us, Mind Science, he was fascinated with the mystery of the human mind. What makes us human? We have a brain that is 3 pounds of, I won't say jelly, but it's 3 pounds of physical material. Yet each of us has this glorious subjective experience of the world. We love, we can taste, we can enjoy, we can share and visit. And where does that come from? How does the brain create the mind and this wonderful subjective self that we all enjoy? And that started with Tom Slick's curiosity about what makes us tick.
Ben, how did a Stanford-educated scientist with 1 million social media followers get connected to the Mind Science Foundation as its chief scientist?
Well, it all started actually when I applied to the Brainstorm Neuroscience Pitch Competition, which is the Mind Science Foundation's primary funding mechanism nowadays for early career scientists. So as a researcher at Stanford...
We need to hear more about that from you.
Yes.
In a minute.
But
that was your connection.
Yeah, and we will talk much more about that. But so I applied, and I ended up winning and getting very involved with the foundation, and just really fell in love. First off, I fell in love with San Antonio, and amazing city, and also just the model of funding, which is super unique, that, as we will discuss later, you don't just write a proposal like a grant like you typically would as a scientist. You also create a video pitch where you explain the proposal so that anybody can understand it. It has this built-in science communication element, which is extremely rare. And in doing so, it really is one of the only sort of funding mechanisms in science that incentivizes researchers to communicate their research clearly. And so I found that to be extremely interesting and compelling and valuable, because I feel that we need to, as a field, as researchers, be more clear and accessible and engage the public more effectively. And the only way that's going to happen is if, busy scientists are incentivized to do so. And so, what a novel, creative, and effective idea to fund research scientists who can most effectively engage the public. So that's how I'm here.
I think the work you're doing is really important. I'm married to a citizen scientist and have met many real scientists through her, but most of them aren't real interested in citizen scientists or speaking that language. They're interested in their own worlds of research and work, and those are the world they stay in, and they often don't come out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as you progress through your academic training, you come across jargon and all these words and this whole scientific language that nobody can understand. You learn to understand it through your training. And then there's no active component of scientific education, like formal graduate school, that kind of stuff, that sort of teaches you to back translate to the public. You learn to dive into this academic world where you speak in front of other scientists and, they know what you're talking about. But if the average person were in that room, they would not be able to follow it. And so, I'm a huge proponent of educating scientists to speak more clearly. And in fact, I'm actually going to be teaching a class on science communication at Stanford in the coming semester. And so, I'm all about this stuff. And mind science is really rare in the way that it targets that specific area.
Well, that's great. Miriam, what is the award that the Mind Science Foundation offers young scientists?
As Ben said, it's the Brainstorm Neuroscience Pitch Competition. And we have an RFP that we open in the spring. It's actually active now. If there are any neuroscientists out there wanting to apply at mindscience.org, just want to plug that. And so out of the applicants, 3 are chosen as finalists. And so as Ben mentioned, part of that process is they submit a research proposal, which is, we've funded research for decades. And so that's not different for us. It goes through a rigorous peer review. It's solid science. But that other piece is what sets us apart, which is the pitch video. And Mind Science is as committed to funding the research that will unlock answers to intractable problems with health and well-being. We're as interested and committed to that as we are to making sure that research is communicated in a way that gets people excited about science and also builds trust in science. And I don't need to say any more about how desperately we need people to be scientifically literate and educated and not opposed to scientific endeavor. And I always go back to my experience with Mind Science. We moved here in 2008, and I come from a background of indigent healthcare. And so when we moved here, I thought, I really want to stay in healthcare. Could not find an opening or a place to get in. And I don't even remember where I saw how I got connected, but I was hired at Mind Science to be the member relations person and development. And through the course of time, a couple years later, I became the leader of the organization. But what happened for me about 2 years in, because I don't have a science background, it never occurred to me to be scientifically interested. But here I was after about 2 years with this deep dive on brain science and specifically the neuroscience of human consciousness. So as I said before, how does the brain create the mind? What can we find out about that? And I so clearly remember sitting at our conference room table, and it was like a light bulb went on. And all of a sudden, I understood a couple of things. number one, science is beautiful. It's a wonderful endeavor. It's a wonderful way to experience the world. And there's a richness to that I didn't have beforehand. Second piece of that is regret, because I have a neurodivergent child. And if I'd known what I know now about how the brain works, I would have been, I think, a better parent or a more effective parent. And at least I would have had the knowledge to share with him so that it wasn't a mystery to him. And so I'm personally committed to giving everybody that aha moment. And I'm privileged to be able to do that through Mind Science.
Well, never too late with your own son.
It's not, yeah.
I assume there's a financial component to this award that's attracting scientists from near and far to apply?
Yes, there is.
How much, if I may ask?
So they are $30,000 awards. 3 people, scientists will win that.
Every year?
Every year.
That's real money.
It is real money. And I think Ben can comment on
tell me first
how real that is. But and then they have submitted their pitch videos. So the 3 people who made it to the finals have their videos put on our website, and then they're voted on. People from around the world can view them and vote on them for their favorite.
Can we vote?
Anybody can vote.
Okay.
Please vote.
Please vote.
Ben, I would have voted for you, I promise.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
That's kind of why he's here today. But anybody can vote. And so we come together in mid-October, like we are this year, on October 22nd. And the finalists are brought to San Antonio. We have a really lively panel discussion. This is all built for the public so that you can come in person, meet a scientist, learn more about the brain. But how we cap that evening off is the winner of the Audience Choice Award gets an extra $10,000.
And that person's announced live there at the event?
That person is announced live there. I think there's 2 of us who know who it is, the printer and
It's like
me.
the Oscars.
It is like the Oscars.
And they get a gigantic check.
And everybody gets the gigantic check. And it's so meaningful.
So that's coming up this year, and it's open to the public, and we can focus people's attention on that in our newsletter a little later in the year when we get closer to the date. And
absolutely.
And we're invited.
Absolutely.
All right, and we're going to vote.
If you're an early career researcher, the grant is open right now. So $100,000 total in funding. I should also note that's not affected whatsoever by any federal changes or regulations.
That'll be welcome.
Yes, absolutely. And I know there's a great need for that right now. And so, but that money is, the RFP is out. So you can apply now. The event will be in October, and that'll be here in San Antonio. And that'll be open to the public.
Miriam, I know that you've funded research around the world, and we can talk about some of those projects here a little later in the podcast. But is the competition open to scientists around the world, or nationally? What's the
It's international. We've funded some research here in San Antonio, one individual from UT Health and another from UTSA. They were both in different years, but basically studying social isolation. And what was really timely is that the woman who was studying social isolation was doing that before COVID, and her project kind of overlapped pre-COVID and active COVID.
But that was a research project, not an award?
No, when I say project, I'm using that
so
interchangeably.
So anyone listening from anywhere is eligible to compete for that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, last year we had a winner from France. The year before we had a winner from Holland.
Oh, that's exciting. And they came here.
Yep.
Yes.
What did you do with your research time and resources after winning?
So you mean, well, there's multiple questions there. You mean what research did I do or?
Well, no, I mean, after you were selected as a winner, did that help you along with some project that was underway or that you had hoped to undertake?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we've had winners over the last few years that I've been involved, that I've spoken to, who have said, like, this is literally going to change my career because my lab had just run out of money, and now this is going to pay for me to work for another year and finish my research project and publish it and be able to go on to the next step of my career. And so Sometimes the money can be used for reagents and for experiments. Other times it can be used for that kind of thing, for someone's salary in a deficit. But yeah, I mean, especially, and I want to emphasize this is again for early career researchers. So we're talking PhD students and postdocs, which is the stage after, which for those who aren't aware, it's like a residency for a scientist, the doctor's residency. And so we're really looking to support, especially right now, those early career researchers who could use the extra funds for, if there's, particular projects they need to get over the finish line, or because we also recognize that, this isn't an R01 grant, which is the big federal one, which is millions of dollars, but it's a significant amount of money that can help people, bolster their projects by adding additional experiments or support salaries, things like that.
Miriam, if the Mind Science Foundation isn't known as well locally as it should be, is it known well in scientific circles where people like Ben around the country and even outside the country are aware that that you exist and that there's this competition?
Yes, we have over 25 years of building relationships with researchers internationally, going to conferences, supporting conferences, and then funding individuals along the way. So especially, for whatever reason, especially in Europe, Western Europe, we are very well known. We get regular submissions from that area of the world. So what we're not as well known is in San Antonio. And like many small organizations in this, big city, small town that we call San Antonio, I hear frequently that, oh, I didn't know about you. And we're a hidden gem. We're right there in Olmos Park, across from the fire department, doing our work, encouraging and funding young scientists, and also having an educational outreach so that people in this room can learn about their brains.
So one of the reasons I asked that is you're a nonprofit. You have to raise money. As a matter of fact, that was your first job, was in development for the Mind Science Foundation. How are you raising money? Is it local? Is it national or international? Is it from foundations or individuals?
Our funding resources are varied. We are very fortunate to have an endowment left by Tom Slick. And that supplies income for our basic needs, the lights, the heat,
the unsexy stuff,
all that sexy stuff that makes it possible for us to actually do the work. But we are really reliant on donors for us to do any expansion beyond that. So donors are the source of the funding for Brainstorm. And that's $100,000 plus the expense of the event. So
bringing people in and everything else.
Bringing people in, that's like around $150,000. And so we just had our gala at the end of February, and that supplies a big chunk of that. But we also have generous individual donors who are committed to our mission as well. And then, we have the $5, $10, $20 donors, which we equally love. And it's interesting. We are a foundation. So most other foundations do not make grants to other foundations. And so that's a challenge that we have, is finding non-foundation donors.
Ben, this is actually the second program we've done over the course of a couple of years with the brain scientists in the room. We had Dr. Peter Fox on from UT Health San Antonio, who is the founder of the Advanced Research Imaging Institute, I think is the name. And he was specifically here to talk about MRI work that he's doing to explore pediatric near-fatal drowning syndrome, which I think his research has shown that those children that suffer that unfortunate event are not vegetables, in quotes, but in fact are people with minds that are very active and emotional, and they just can't communicate in traditional ways. And unlocking that locked-in syndrome is key. I'm interested in what you see out there that's really cutting edge, that's happening with brain science, and I wanted to bring up two specific topics with you to get your reaction and then invite you to just talk about anything else. One is the sudden front page news we're reading almost every day on GLP-1 drugs, which are the pharmaceuticals, I think, that were developed to treat diabetes, type 2 diabetes, but have since become universally accepted as weight loss drugs and are really helping people with morbid obesity and other conditions that have been resistant to any other treatment. And the other thing that I'm particularly interested in at age 72 is staving off the advance of dementia and what we're learning about how people can live their lives to avert that or to lessen the chances of that happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, with the GLP-1 drugs, I'll admit I don't know as much as I should to answer your question completely. I'm not really familiar with the mechanism. All I know is that they're becoming very popular, and I'm sure there is a lot of research out there. I'm not familiar with it. So I could only speculate, and kind of one of the places that I source my integrity is from not speculating on things that I don't know a lot about, or at least I'm not up to date on the literature on. So unfortunately, your question will have to go unanswered for today. But I can answer your second one about Alzheimer's and mitigating risk. When it comes to reducing Alzheimer's risk, it's unfortunately the same boring things that you've heard a bunch of times. Diet, obviously eating a clean, healthy diet. There seemed to be some pretty convincing evidence that certain foods and certain sort of nutrients can be helpful. So I'm 99% sure, again, haven't checked the literature recently, but omega-3s are increased intake of omega-3s, which are in like fish, are associated with reduced risk of Alzheimer's. Secondly, sleep is obviously huge. Exercise, social interaction, all the things that you might traditionally think of as very basic sort of health measures are also protective for the brain. I'm happy to go into greater depth on any of those, but I think that one that I'm personally interested in and happen to know probably the most about is the social component. Isolation is just the worst. It's really, really bad for you at any age. It's exceptionally bad for you at an advanced age because this is, basically social isolation almost induces or increases the risk of just about everything. But it increases the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. It causes all sorts of problems. And that is unfortunately very bad in later life because as we age, we also become just naturally at greater risk of all those things. So you have this sort of like evil synergistic effect. And the worst thing of all is that the data show that as people, at least in America and Western cultures, as people get older, they spend more and more and more time alone. So it's something that really needs to be addressed, and we really need to talk about it more, I think. And the solution is quite simple, which is great. Get out there and talk to people.
I've actually read that people that do isolate like that and sort of slip into dementia lose their language skills, and that accelerates the problem.
Yeah, right. Because then you struggle to communicate, and then things get only worse. Yeah.
So how about Scrabble? I'm joking, but people say if you do crossword puzzles, do Sudoku, whatever, do Scrabble. That those kinds of mind exercises are very good for both memory enhancement and just general sharpness of.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think about the brain like a complete body of different muscles, right? And if you go to the gym every single day and you do bicep curls, your biceps are going to get really strong. Nothing else is really going to happen in your body. If you do Sudoku every single day, you'll probably get really good at whatever particular brain regions that exercise engages. But, you're not going to get any better at cooking, right? Or you brush your teeth with your left hand for a week or two, you'll get better at coordinating that movement, but you won't get better at Sudoku. So you need to think about activities that engage a bunch of different brain areas and brain systems. Social interaction is one of those. It's like an exercise for the brain. I mean, there's so much to it that we don't really think about. But to your point, there's this idea of something called cognitive reserve. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
So the idea is that the more brain matter you build up throughout your life, the more resilient you are to neurodegeneration, which happens naturally as we age. Everybody experiences, unfortunately, synapse loss as they age. And synapses are the connections between brain cells. You have 86 billion neurons. Each of them has maybe 1,000 synapses. So there are like an incalculable number of synapses in your brain, But as we age, they progressively die and go away. And those synapses are incredibly important. They are basically those are like the muscles of the brain, really, that allow you to do everything. And so it makes sense naturally that if you have more synapses, more brain matter, more neurons, as that process happens, you will hold on to your capacities for longer. And so doing things like Sudoku, there's no concrete evidence of this that I'm aware of, but, just basically keeping your brain challenged is helpful, because as soon as you, again, with the muscle analogy, when you don't use it, it can atrophy. And so, socializing can be another good way to sort of complement that. And there are actually, believe it or not, studies that show that people who socialize more have larger brains because probably of this cognitive, this exercise effect that it kind of builds up more brain matter. And then those people are maybe relatedly more resilient and less vulnerable to cognitive decline and Alzheimer's and dementia.
Well, beyond those two subjects, what's the area of interest that you find yourself in right now as a scientist?
Well, I have so many answers to this because the field is always growing in every direction. We could talk about psychedelics. We could talk about empathy.
I'm interested in psychedelics and their use that I understand is being studied at some of the leading research institutes, Harvard, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, that using psychedelics to treat people with terminally ill cancer, people with PTSD, deep depression, and the results are very positive. And that unfortunately, ever since the 70s, the Nixon era, we have vilified psychedelics as a possibly valuable pharmaceutical path to take. And Timothy Leary didn't do anybody any favors with his hippy dippy approach to everything. And most of us boomers had experience with psychedelics for better or worse. And now they seem to be back in a more controlled clinical way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, definitely controlled clinical are keywords. We're talking about people taking these drugs under the supervision of trained professionals in very comfortable clinical settings, but, kind of like what you might want for a psychedelic experience, music playing, eye mask on, you have whatever you need accessible to you, you're journaling, you have a therapist there. But it's funny because, as a researcher, I have worked in this field directly. My last paper, one of the last papers I published was on MDMA and empathy. And many of my colleagues at Stanford also study psychedelics. And it's just so funny because the way that we talk about psychedelics, privately as scientists, is very optimistic and enthusiastic. And then occasionally I'll stumble, into a conversation with someone who's not really familiar with the science, and they assume that the scientific field is very no, we don't like this. But in truth, I think that the general public is actually more skeptical now than the researchers are. At least, I don't want to speak for all researchers, but most. Because the evidence is extremely impressive, and it's not that, you take ketamine and it cures everything, or psilocybin, it cures everything. Of course not. And there are some scientists who propose that, and they are very wrong. But, the idea is that maybe ketamine is just extremely effective for depression, major depressive disorder. MDMA is extremely effective for PTSD. Of course, none of these drugs have passed the sort of clinical threshold and become available in the United States. But
in other words, a physician couldn't prescribe you one of those drugs.
There are some confusing, ketamine's on the cusp there. I know there are certain states where you can get it, I believe, and same thing with psilocybin. But for the most part, they're not available. But, and I'm not even trying to sound like a, psychedelic evangelical, but I think when you look at the data, they're very, very compelling. And if you took all the context, the historical context out of the discussion, and you just planted a group of researchers together and you had them look at the clinical trials that have been done, first off, for most of these drugs, when you compare them with the existing psychiatric interventions, they vastly exceed what are shown in the clinical trials. And I think if you show them any of these trials, they would say, wow, we need to, fast track this to the clinics. But the historical context of everything that has happened with all these psychedelics makes it so that they're under such additional scrutiny, which is actually a good thing. And it's maybe something that should be, a scrutiny that should be applied to all interventions and potential pharmacological agents. But it has also caused a lot of holdups. And so, I happen to believe in the data. Of course, there are a lot of things going on when you give people psychedelics. They have intense experiences, and it's hard to blind the placebo group and stuff. So there are a lot of other issues, but overall, I mean, it's pretty impressive. And
Miriam, you've funded the Mind Science Foundation has funded some of that work, have you not?
We have. We have funded 3 projects, actually 2 in the last 2 years, but for different conditions. One was looking at if you gave human patients, because a lot of these studies are done in mice, but this was a group of people in a minimally conscious state. So you were talking about Dr. Fox's work with pediatric non-fatal drowning and people being locked in. But we know that psychedelics increase brain complexity. So the idea of this proposal was, if you can administer psychedelics to those patients, might it not raise the level of their consciousness concurrently? And so we're waiting to see how that, what the results of that are. And we've also funded an individual at Stanford who is looking at psilocybin as a potential treatment for opioid addiction. And I'm not a scientist, but what was really compelling for me is that she's looking at, can you, in any kind of psychedelic substance, can you split off the experience from whatever mechanism it might have in the brain that affects the addiction or the depression? So could there ultimately be a prescription that you could get from your doctor for that derivative of a psychedelic that doesn't give you a trip? It just, if we can figure out what that piece is doing in the brain that's disconnected from the experience, that would be a game changer.
And that's a really good question of consciousness too, right? Because psychedelics, like I said, they induce these profound, powerful experiences. People come out of the experience with, lower depression scores, whatever it is. Did their depression scores go down because they had a profound psychological conscious experience, or because pharmacologically the drug went in their brain and tinkered with specific systems that are related to depression and then induced some effect just on a biological basis, and the trip itself was unrelated? And that's a really hard question to tease out, but there are some people exploring that.
So let me ask if you've read the book by Michael Pollan, Change Your Mind. And, we live in a world where people my age, boomers, many I know, including myself, have taken gummies with THC or CBD for everything from, trying to help with sleep to anti-anxiety. I'm aware of people in my children's generation, millennials, microdosing mushrooms, magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and have talked to one psychiatrist who said those can trigger some very terrible latent bipolar tendencies and other effects that people aren't aware of, that may have read the book and gotten excited about it, and they're self-medicating. And I just wonder, with such problems right now socially with fentanyl on the streets, what fentanyl has done to the vagrant community here and in every city. It's resulted in many more overdoses and deaths. What your thoughts are about how the popular use of drugs, whether it's just the legalization of marijuana, which is, a very low level thing, to people deciding that they can change their minds on their own, and what the impact of that.
Well, one of the key factors here is that certain psychedelics, like ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, a handful of them they have been shown to potentially induce psychosis. For someone who is genetically predisposed to schizophrenia, that psychedelic experience might be what it takes for their brain to, trigger psychosis for the first time and then induce their, from there on out, schizophrenia. That's obviously a big concern. And so when people are doing it on the, just illegally, basically, that's a risk because you don't really know what your risk profile is. All the studies that I'm talking about in these clinical trials that have been published, they always screen people carefully to make sure that they are, not at risk for that. And the risk factors, like one of them, which is obvious, family history. Do you have a relative with psychosis or schizophrenia? So yeah, people need to be careful. These are very robust drugs, and they need to be used carefully, and ideally they should not be used illegally.
Well, I think that just points out the fact that you need to understand, the public needs to understand that just because it's in a headline or somebody wrote a best-selling book does not mean the science is there.
Yeah.
And one thing that's, through the years as I've spent time with scientists and looked at their work is that you have to have a very, not skeptical, but a very close attention to what is the science behind it? What was it good science? Was it did they try this on a population of 10 or 500? So being scientifically literate helps a person wade through the headlines and make good choices for themselves.
So we're here to talk about the Mind Science Foundation, by the way, but I can't help but ask both of you what your thoughts are about this anti-science moment that we're living, where people no longer trust vaccines, where we're seeing measles and polio outbreaks again, diseases that we thought were eradicated domestically, people second guessing, like Dr. Anthony Fauci during the COVID-19 pandemic. And now our fear, which I've heard from many people below the radar that are in our science community here, their deep-seated fear over losing all of the funding from the federal government for institutions like the Southwest Research Institute, Texas Biomedical Institute, UT Health San Antonio, et cetera. And I'm sure wherever you come into the world of science, that could have a profoundly negative impact. But it seems to be something that's captured the attention of at least half of the country.
Well, I'll just jump in because I know Ben's going to have really great things to say from a scientific point of view. But from my point of view as a lay person with an appreciation for science, but I came to that appreciation late. And for me, it's tragic that people don't trust science. But I think it's because they haven't been communicated with in a way that makes sense to them. And there are so many factors and underlying this mistrust of science and scientists. But I think part of it is having access to relatable communication about science. And then something else that, it's hard to have on a broad scale, meet a scientist, spend some time with the scientist, get to know, I am so fortunate. I have a whole group of, I have my own group of personal neuroscientists that I can go to, and you develop trust through that. And again, that's not something that you can duplicate on a mass scale, but I just think it points up how incredibly important it is to present science authentically.
Well, let's go to Ben. Ben, what are your thoughts on that, and how do we reverse that and get people once again to believe in the value and how do we get people to believe in science again?
Well, so let's look at Miriam's story. You came into the Mind Science Foundation and basically learned that, whoa, science is cool and it's meaningful and I can use this information for my personal life. A lot of people have not had that experience. And if you ask anybody, how much do you know about science? It's probably very little. And to be fair, I think that if not for the work of journalism, how would anybody know anything about what's happening in science today? There would be no education, because scientists, sorry to go at the whole ivory tower metaphor analogy, but it's true. Like, scientists publish research and then it goes into scientific journals, which are held behind paywalls. And even if you get through the paywall, then it's full of jargon. You can't understand it.
Hard to read.
And so how is the public supposed to engage with this or learn anything from this? And so, again, without the work of journalism, there's no dialogue between science and the public. And so when your favorite news station or your favorite politician or whoever, your best friend tells you, oh, whatever, SSRIs are dangerous, or science, vaccines are dangerous, whatever it is, most people have absolutely no logical basis to refute that claim because they don't engage with the science. They've not been educated or reached directly. And so scientists need to do a better job of training up on how to communicate with the public. building infrastructure to directly interact with the public. Personally, I do it through social media, and it works. And I've actually done surveys where I've asked people who follow me, since you follow me, do you feel more connected with science, more trusting of science? And the numbers were outstanding. Like we had 700 people respond, and 84% of them said they feel more trusting of science and scientists since watching my silly little 60-second Instagram and TikTok videos. You would never think that would work, but it does, because people are not reached.
Are those your principal platforms for reaching people, or what is your social media profile?
Yeah, mostly Instagram and TikTok. Yeah,
and tell people that are listening how to find you.
So my name is Ben, Rein, so I go by Dr. Brain, Brein.
Oh, very cool.
So if you just search the word brain with the letter E instead of an A, Brein, it should pop up. But anyways,
TikTok, Instagram, where else?
Threads. I'm on, if you speak Chinese, I'm on Bilibili. I don't speak Chinese, but I have a team who dubs Chinese, so I'm there. It's like Chinese YouTube, and YouTube, I should also say. So
Okay.
yeah, I try to hit them all. Anyways, all that to say, it's critical to do that, to reach people. And so that's why I'm such a big fan of the Mind Science Foundation and what we're doing, because we are having scientists, as part of their applications to get funding, create videos that anybody can watch and understand. And they can say, oh, now I understand what this scientist is, what questions they're asking, how they're going to do the experiments. It's a lesson in science by watching the video, and you get to understand, what's on the cutting edge of science. People watch the videos, they vote for the videos, then they have a chance. So multiple goals here. We have now gotten scientists to practice their science communication skills. We have engaged the public directly. And then best of all, we have this in-person event in San Antonio where I moderate a panel with the winners, and we talk about everything. Last year, we talked about psychedelics. We talked about Alzheimer's disease. We talked about brain-computer interfaces and artificial intelligence. And the people who came in through the door got to vote on what we spoke about. So it's this whole kind of tripartite model of bringing science to the public and doing so in a way that's really innovative and addresses a lot of core problems in society. So that's why I'm such a huge fan of it. I
think you've crossed over to do very important work as a communicator, as opposed to just a scientist, and decoding that for people and getting them interested. My fear is that it's easy to say, we should cut the federal government, the agencies, the workforce. It's all faceless and anonymous. But you can't take a chainsaw to networks that have been carefully developed over decades. And when people here start to see the result of, if those hundreds of millions of dollars, research dollars, go away, that important work, people's jobs and livelihoods, it's all going to go away with it. And it'll be very hard to reconstruct it in short order.
And one thing that I learned in my journey, learning to appreciate science that I didn't understand, is that research builds on previous research. You don't go into a lab and figure out how to cure cancer. It's you build on what other people have done. And if there's this hiatus for however long, the damage, I can't even imagine the damage that's going to do to future research, because there's going to be a gap there. And you're going to have scientists who are going to leave the field. Early career scientists might have a choice to make. They might have to leave the field. And that is going to do incalculable damage in so many different arenas: health, the climate, the earth. Anybody who does any research, there's going to be a gap in there.
Yeah. I heard someone on social media, I wish I could credit the creator. They were a doctor, and to summarize kind of what does this pause mean? They said, if you've ever been in a hospital or had, unfortunately, someone going through a really bad situation in the hospital, and you're asking the doctors, isn't there anything that can be done? What can be done? The answer to that question, that those experimental things that maybe can be tested, that is what this research funding goes to pushing the boundaries of our existing knowledge of medicine and what can be done to create new, potentially better therapeutics. And so without research, that doesn't get any better. And so, you go to a hospital today, you go to a hospital 50 years from now, without any research, you're getting the exact same treatments. With research, the treatments are going to be accelerating and getting a lot more effective.
One irony is that I've heard from many people in leadership positions, Miriam, in our city, that are involved in organizations with substantial federal research dollars. that they're reluctant to speak publicly about what they're telling me about privately because of the political moment we're in. And so in my mind, the scientific voice is not being heard very robustly across the nation right now because the people that could be pushing back, they have a lot at stake, and they have to be very careful about how they push back.
And it just puts a damper, as Ben said, it just puts a damper on scientific endeavors. If you're afraid you're going to lose your job, that's life-changing. And so I understand why some individuals are hesitant to speak out and are only speaking out, kind of off mic or personally. Again, I just think it's a tragedy that we're not going to understand the full depth of this until years later, or maybe 5 years later.
Well, we're running out of time, but I think we should be very proud in San Antonio of the Mind Science Foundation being here. I think it's a center of excellence, and it brings people like Ben into our world that otherwise wouldn't be there. And I want to make a plug, Miriam, for something the Mind Science Foundation used to do years ago that you don't do anymore, but they were called the Imagineer Awards. And when I look back and reflect on those, I think that was the Mind Science Foundation going out into the community and finding citizen scientists and others who weren't scientific professionals and finding ways to put a spotlight on them and their work. And I think it was a very positive way to bring the public into the Mind Science Foundation, people that aren't necessarily involved in science day to day in their world. And I don't know what happened to those awards, but they went away and they ought to come back. You'll
be happy to know that we are actually considering that because, again, it has to do with, we have great connections outside of San Antonio, but we have so much going on in San Antonio that we want to revive and go back to shining that spotlight on what's happening right here.
Well, Dr. Rainn, Ben Rainn, and Miriam Good from the Mind Science Foundation, thanks for coming on to Big City, Small Town, and we will see you guys, if not sooner, in October.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Please share this episode with friends and colleagues, and do sign up for our new newsletter, Monday Musings. Big City, Small Town is brought to you by Western Urban, building the city our children want to call home, and Geekdom, where startups are born and smart ideas become businesses. Our producer is Corey Ames, video by Erica Rempel, sound engineering by Alfie De La Garza of Sound Crane Audio. We will see you next week.